recently there was a number of reports of uh, the Chinese government building a OAU headquarters, I believe, in Ethiopia, and a spine on the OAU, Organization of African Unity. Uh, can you kind of like explain what happened there, how it was resolved, and what kind of relationship China has with the OAU?
Uh, yes, the OU building was built by China as a gift to the African Union, African continent. This spying case was first reported a few weeks ago, but I don't have the latest status on this. I don't think this, if proven true, I don't think this will negatively affect the relationship. I think this most likely is an isolated case, and I'm not sure whether uh, these bugs, placed in the buildings, whether they were even approved by the government. I don't know the details. I have to say, but again, we have to look at the broad picture. Because China's investment is not just in infrastructure, in stadium or railways. China has also lots of investment in agriculture, helping all these uh, countries to develop their local agriculture economy. China's investment is also in public health. I think actually since the 1960s, China has constantly sent medical teams to many African countries to help them fight against all kinds of diseases. Uh, I think again, if you look at the broad picture, uh, you see more positive sides. And are there any problems? I'm sure there are problems. There are dark sides. But I think again, it takes efforts from both sides to address those issues.
Mhm. Well, now, of course, it's clear that China has a non-interventionist kind of policy with Africa. How does that play out in relationship to the Western conditional policies, where they attempt to tweak and control the governments? Why is China in a non-interventionist position there when it's giving aid, technical aid, military, or and economic aid?
Yes, that's a complicated issue because this non-interference policy has been one of the uh, foreign policy pillars of China since the 1950s. These so-called five principles of peaceful coexistence, and one of the principles is non-existence. Uh, these principles were actually first uh, signed, agreed upon between China and India. Uh, and those principles were also later adopted by many African and Asian countries. So today, the question is today, China as a growing power and with huge influence, uh, should China get more heavily involved in international affairs? Uh, I think China is in a dilemma now because China still wants to follow this non-interventionist policy, but at the same time, because of its growing interest in Africa and other regions, it almost become inevitable that uh, it will China will become somehow involved in local businesses. I mean, already we heard the reports from countries like Nigeria, for example, uh, Chinese diplomats were kind of involved in local elections, publicly favoring one particular candidate. That's an evidence of getting involved in local politics. But I think on the other hand, maybe China should get involved in promoting uh, good governance and better human rights conditions in those countries, environmental issues. I think if China works with NGOs and civic society of these countries, I think it will be a win-win for China and for those countries. And in the process, yes, uh, people will charge China with interfering in local affairs. But I think that might be a good kind of interference, if I may say so.
And I guess one of the things that concerns me, obviously being African American, is the slavery in Northern Africa, in the Sudan in particular. which I understand China has a very strong relationship with, and now in Libya and across that stretch there, to some degree in Mauritania and so on. What's China's? I mean, it's China has a strong relationship up there. What's their actual position on the slavery of Black Africans in Northern Africa, in those countries it has a relationship with?
Well, again, no, this goes back to China's so-called non-interventionist policy. I think the Chinese government has refrained from publicly commenting on these kind of issues because they think that this might be an evidence of interfering in African countries' internal affairs. But as I mentioned earlier, yeah, on those kind of issues, probably China should stand up and voice its view uh, and criticize human rights violations in some of those countries. But I haven't seen much of that kind of activity from China, and that's something I think China will have to do a better job.
In the past, the colonial relationship have always been a railroad from the raw materials, the resources to the ports, etc. I'm asking, is China leaving any kind of physical infrastructure in Africa or where they can process their own resources or manufacture their own goods and that kind of stuff? Is anything being left behind other than mobile transportation of the resources?
Uh, yes, I mean it's complicated. I think if you talk about the let's say uh, the new railway linking Ethiopia to Djibouti. Yes, and the railway, first of all, that was built by China. It's the first modern electrified railway in Africa. But also the trains that are operating along the railway are also provided and manufactured in China. Uh, and if you're asking whether Chinese businesses are turning some of these African countries into manufacturing centers, I think probably not. I mean, there are some Chinese businesses that have operated and have opened factories in African countries, but I think China's activity, China's investment, typically take the form of investing and building infrastructure and providing financial support. Uh, I don't think there's a huge wave of Chinese movement, moving people and facilities, manufacturing into Africa. I don't think that that's the case. But yes, in terms of legacy of China's investment, you do definitely everywhere you go. I mean, you will see the traces of China's investment in terms of the facilities used, the projects they built, uh, even in cultural activities. I think China has built many so-called Confucius institutes in quite a few countries. Those Confucius institutes basically provide teaching materials about China, Chinese history, Chinese culture. The teaching materials are also provided by the Chinese side, and even the language instructors are from China. So you do see many cases of strong Chinese presence in the region. But on the other hand, I think the Chinese activities in Africa are also limited in the sense that they are not really a colonial power trying to dominate and occupy the whole continent. I think there are some nuances. I guess we have to take a more holistic approach to observing and analyzing what is happening in Africa.
Okay. I know I said that was the final question, but one final question that I was thinking about it as you were talking. In the foreseeable future, uh, it seems that Africa still won't have its ability to manufacture and support its own processing of raw materials and its citizens with creature comforts or goods, whether it's manufacturing, whatnot, with this relationship. I mean, uh, how does this look in the future for Africa and China if the, the the stuff that's being given is educational and the stuff that's being taken away is raw materials? Uh, how does this differ from how the Western powers are interacting with Africa?
Yes. I think this is a very good question. I think the question really about how we can all work together to help African countries to develop. I mean, I think what China is doing in Africa offers a different model, uh, an alternative to Western model, to American model. I think if China and other powers work together, and they can really create these conditions for African countries to grow. For example, I think China has a lot of financial resources, so that's why you see a growing Chinese investment in all African countries. But China has probably done a poor job in developing uh, technological skills of workers and providing technical support of these countries. And right there, I think Western countries, including the United States, can perhaps help because Western countries in general have better technology, more skilled in management. I think if you combine these two resources with the financial power of China, with the technological power of the Western countries, again, I think Western countries will, African countries will really benefit from this external support and help. But I don't see that right now because many Western countries tend to view China's investment in Africa as a threat to their own interest over there. They tend to see this as a zero-sum game. But my argument is that no, I think we can turn this competition into a win-win game for everybody. Everybody can benefit from these new economic activities. For China, of course, it needs resources, it needs market. But for African countries, they need help, they need economic development, and they need to improve their governance, human rights, environmental standards. But for Western countries, they can continue to invest and providing technical support. They can continue to form a strong relationship with African countries. So in the end, if we all work together, I think it will be a beneficial relationship for everybody. I think really Western countries and China should work together to form this new 21st century relationship with African countries.